بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. بإذن today we'll be covering the legacy of Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī. And I've mentioned previously in our lessons on the Mukhtaṣar that what makes al-Qudūrī special and his Mukhtaṣar special is that it's not just one book. What I mean by this is it's not just a simple primer which was authored in the madhhab and then it has a few commentaries. Now Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī is perhaps the most influential work in the madhhab, and this is because after it was authored, from the earliest time, from his students' time, we find that the Mukhtaṣar has commentaries, and from that time we find that other scholars who understood the value of the Mukhtaṣar as early as al-Marghīnānī was only about 100 years after al-Imām al-Qudūrī. He says that the most important books that were being taught in our institutions in my time were the Jami' al-Saghīr of Imām Muhammad and Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī. So the value of Quduri is not restricted to it being a primer which is easy to read, or it being a good book for beginners, or it having a lot of the ma'ani of fiqh hidden within it. This is all there, but it's also the tradition that revolves around the Mukhtaṣar. Multiple commentaries, multiple tafri'at, books which stem from the Mukhtaṣar, and likewise manzumat, books of all sorts we have gathering around the Mukhtaṣar. So the book itself is extremely pivotal to the madhhab in the sense that there is so much information that stemmed, and so many different types of books, not just commentaries, but different types of books that stem from the Mukhtaṣar. And for this reason we've created a chart to help us understand the most important books that stem from the Mukhtaṣar, beginning with the commentaries, as obviously students who are studying the Mukhtaṣar should be accustomed to certain commentaries of the Mukhtaṣar. So the earliest commentary we can find perhaps is that of al-Imām al-Qudūrī student, al-Aqṭaʿ. Al-Aqṭaʿ, Abu Nasr al-Aqṭaʿ, actually had two commentaries. It's not a single commentary. He first wrote a commentary which perhaps we can refer to as al-Muqni', because in the manuscripts we find that the name Muqni' is there. And this was a short commentary, such that the students had requested from him, or his friends, those who were close to him, they requested from him that this commentary is a bit short. Perhaps you can write a larger commentary in which you mention the adillah, the proofs of the school, a larger commentary in which you mention the ilal, the legal reasonings adopted by the school, etc., etc. And so al-Aqṭaʿ, he went ahead and he wrote a larger commentary on the Mukhtaṣar as well. And this is the famous commentary which we have access to today, bihamdillah. It was there in manuscript form, and now I believe it has been printed as well. And the commentary is very special. It's special for a number of reasons. The first of which being he is al-Qudūrī student. So of course, being al-Qudūrī student, he understands the text perhaps the best of any of the commentators, in the sense that he studied directly from the author of the text. But beyond that, al-Aqṭaʿ, he has a habit, and that habit is that he oftentimes quotes from the books of al-Imām al-Qudūrī. So he'll bring the text from al-Imām al-Qudūrī, and then he'll bring his commentary, but he's going to take a big chunk of text from al-Imām al-Qudūrī's other books such as al-Tajreed, other books such as Sharh Mukhtaṣar al-Karhi, other books such as al-Taqrīb, all of which we've explained in previous lessons. He's going to take the content from this book and use it to explain the Mukhtaṣar. This is why the book is very special. And alongside this, there's also one more aspect which makes the book special, and that is the fact that al-Imām al-Aqṭaʿ had access to different manuscripts. Now oftentimes when manuscripts are written on a book, it's possible for certain mistakes to be found. And oftentimes this is what happens, you'll find mistakes in manuscripts. But because al-Aqṭaʿ had access to different manuscripts, he was able to pinpoint many of the areas where the manuscripts would differ, and along with that he was also able to pinpoint the correct version of the text. And this is key, it's crucial, because of the fact that he's right after al-Imām al-Qudūrī. He's very near in terms of the time period he lived in. Of course, he's a student of Quduri. So the fact that someone so close to al-Qudūrī is telling us that this manuscript is correct as opposed to a different manuscript, this holds a lot of value, because as time moves on, more manuscripts are written, and when more manuscripts are written, more mistakes are made. But the fact that al-Aqṭaʿ, being one of the earliest commentators, is telling us that there's different manuscripts over here, this is the correct manuscript, this is the correct wording, that obviously holds a lot of value. So this is what the book is, what's special about the book, the fact that he mentions the adillah, the ilal, most of which is taken from al-Imām al-Qudūrī's words and works, And then along with that, he indicates, or he makes mention of the different manuscripts regarding the book. Next we have, in our section of commentaries, al-Zāhidi's al-Mujtabā. Now, al-Mujtabā of Zāhidi is very inclusive and it's very long. And likewise, Jami' al-Mudmarat of al-Qudūrī, both these commentaries are extremely long. And the benefit behind this is that they mention a lot of different furu', a lot of different texts and discussions and rulings within the madhhab, as well as different riwayat. So I've mentioned previously that Imām al-Qudūrī, when he writes the Mukhtaṣar, he will only mention the most important discussions or the most important rulings in that chapter. So from Bab al-Tahara, you're only going to find the most important discussions in the Mukhtaṣar, which is why it's special, because if you memorize these discussions and you understand these discussions, you can apply the logic in these discussions onto other rulings. And the benefit of al-Mujtabā as well as Jami' al-Mudmarat is that because they're mentioning further rulings, further discussions, further riwayat or furu', you're able to use your logic, which you understood from the Mukhtaṣar, of course based on studying it and based on learning from your teachers. You can use that to test, or you can test that logic against the other furu' mentioned by al-Zāhidi and al-Qudūrī in their respective commentaries. But at this level, when it comes to all of these commentaries, we would not suggest for students to refer back to them because of the fact that they're quite long and it might be a bit difficult to read at this level. Al-Mujtabā, for instance, this is as an extra benefit. Generally speaking, the scholars of Usul al-Ifta, they mention that Al-Mujtabā is not a relied upon book in terms of, from the perspective of issuing verdicts, even though it's a very good commentary. But if you want to issue verdicts, they say you should refer to other books. Now, they have their reasons, and obviously there is room for discussion over here regarding this. But this was just to give you a glimpse of, or give you a general understanding of the book of al-Mujtabā of al-Zāhidi. Then we have al-Haddad. Al-Haddad has two commentaries on the Mukhtaṣar. Now, just like I mentioned, al-Aqṭaʿ also has two commentaries. But the difference over here is that al-Aqṭaʿ, first he authored the smaller commentary, and then he authored the larger commentary. Al-Haddad, on the other hand, he first authored a larger commentary, al-Siraj al-Wahhaj. And then he took this commentary and he summarized it in al-Jawharat al-Nayyirah. And this is why we would suggest for students, if you do want to read an extensive commentary, al-Jawharat al-Nayyirah is an excellent commentary to refer to. Why is this the case? Because oftentimes when authors have written larger books and then they summarize the main points from those larger books, number one, he's writing a commentary twice, so it's going to be more accurate. He's going to correct a lot of mistakes he might have made. And number two, he's giving you the most important information which is required at your level. So Siraj al-Wahhaj is quite extensive. We wouldn't suggest that for students. If you do want to use a commentary, you can use al-Jawharat al-Nayyirah, keeping in mind that it is extensive. Even though it's a shortened version of a Siraj al-Wahhaj, it still is extensive. But the Arabic is simple, and he makes mention of riwayat, of furu'. He also makes mention of adillah, and the ilal, which the Ḥanafī used to understand or to arrive at their conclusions when it comes to different discussions and different rulings. So in that sense, the commentary is good. It gathers everything. And aside from al-Jawharat al-Nayyirah, we also have al-Lubāb of al-Maydānī. Al-Lubāb of al-Maydānī is special, al-Lubāb fi Sharh al-Kitāb, because of the fact that al-Maydānī, as you can see over here, he passed away in 1298. This is much later. And the benefit which we have in al-Lubāb of al-Maydānī is that al-Maydānī is actually the immediate student of Ibn Abidin. The great scholar of the madhhab Ibn Abidin, his student is al-Maydānī. So al-Lubāb was authored keeping the Hashiyah, Ibn Abidin's Hashiyah, his famous Hashiyah, al-Radd al-Muhtar, in mind. And in this sense, the book is extremely good because oftentimes the later scholars of the madhhab, they do refer back to Ibn Abidin, his Hashiyah, Radd al-Muhtar, in order to determine the mu'tamad, the relied upon opinion in the madhhab. So in this sense, the commentary of al-Maydānī is good because he's authoring it after having access to the Hashiyah or after having studied by Ibn Abidin. So in this sense, the book is good. Now obviously there's much more discussion as to how to determine the mu'tamad, the relied upon opinion. The scholars don't simply or don't merely rely only on Ibn Abidin, they look to other books as well. But obviously Ibn Abidin has a very auspicious rank within the school. And so for that reason, al-Lubāb, al-Maydānī being the immediate student of Ibn Abidin, the commentary is very good and it's taught. The commentary itself is taught. We ourselves had taught it in the previous year to our students in Nur al-Idah, a few sections from al-Lubāb. And in general, the commentary is taught. It's simple, it's easy, But there are a few things which possibly he'll leave out. He might leave out at this level, or you have to be able to read between the lines. And obviously, from one perspective, it's good for a student to become accustomed to studying or to reading from commentaries at this level. Why? Because oftentimes in commentaries, they don't mention everything. They might mention one riwayah and they'll indicate the other riwayah. Sometimes they'll mention the proof for one view and they won't mention the proof for the other view. Sometimes they'll use technical terms, very short terms, which a student who studied usul will be aware of, but a student who hasn't studied that different science won't be aware of. So keeping these things in mind, commentaries may tend to be a tad bit difficult from time to time for the student. If a student has the ability to open a commentary, to access a commentary, to understand it, that's amazing. If not, what we actually suggest for students at this level, and what I suggest for students who are studying Quduri in general, is to simply use a hashiyah. And a sufficient hashiyah is al-Mukhtaṣar al-Darūrī, which is printed in the Bushra edition, especially if it has Abu Lubaba's additions with it. Sheikh Abu Lubaba has made certain additions to the print of Quduri, not additions to the text itself, but he has what we call Bayn al-Sutur. He has, for instance, title headings. He has, for instance, if there's a qaida, a rule that's being mentioned, he will pinpoint that a rule is being mentioned. If a dabit is being mentioned, he will pinpoint for you that al-dabita is being mentioned. If, for instance, a ta'rif, a definition is being mentioned, he will pinpoint that for you. So in that sense, the book is very good, and it's very effective. So if a student simply uses al-Mukhtaṣar al-Darūrī and he takes notes in the correct manner, this too, bi'idhnillah, we will explain in a later lesson, how should a student be taking notes when studying the Mukhtaṣar? Because look, Hawashi and Shuruh have a lot of information. At this level, you don't need everything. At this level, you are not in need of everything. But the student has to be able to pinpoint what is important, what he needs to know at this level, and what he doesn't need to know at this level. Obviously, that can be difficult. So that's where your teachers and your instructors will guide you as to what exactly should you be looking for when studying or when reading a hashiyah. And bi'idhnillah will give you worksheets on this as well, and how to take notes on the Mukhtaṣar, which you can use when referring back to the hashiyah on the Mukhtaṣar. In terms of manzumat, we have a few manzumat. We've only mentioned two over here, but there are a few other manzumat as well. But generally speaking, when it comes to memorizing the Mukhtaṣar, we would actually suggest at this level, if you want to memorize, no one's going to stop you, you can memorize the matan. Memorize the matan. But more important than memorizing is that you should have a very strong recollection of the masail, of the discussions mentioned by Quduri, and anything which stems from those discussions. Now what does that mean? From time to time we'll tell you, for instance, Al-Qudūrī has mentioned this, the legal reasoning behind this, and so and so point. Or for instance, we'll mention to you that in this chapter, the main idea, the main philosophy of the Hanafiya is so and so. That needs to be understood. Irrespective of whether you memorize it, whether you write it down, it needs to be in your mind. And you need to be able to mention that when you are asked. Because that key point will help you understand all the discussions within the Mukhtaṣar. And then beyond that, every single mas'ala, every single ruling mentioned in the Mukhtaṣar needs to be kept in mind. You have to be aware of the rulings that are mentioned within the Mukhtaṣar, and how they refer back to that general key point we mentioned to you in the beginning of the bab, for instance. So this needs to be understood, it needs to be retained, and the student needs to be able to mention this when asked. Not just for a few chapters, for every chapter he studies. For every chapter a student studies, at this level, this is the amount that the student needs to retain. And he doesn't have to memorize the text. There's no need to memorize the text. But the mas'ala, when the mas'ala is presented before you, you need to be able to explain the mas'ala as was explained to you, as well as the logic behind that ruling. This is what we're focusing on at this level. And then at later levels, we'll focus on the proof, on the adillah, which are found in the ahadith and Quranic verses, for instance. At later levels, we'll focus on, for instance, we'll do munaqasha, we'll actually engage with the proofs that are mentioned and tell you, for instance, that so-and-so proof is stronger as opposed to another proof. One more thing students have to cover in this level. So we've mentioned two things so far. Number one, the general philosophy behind the chapter. And again, as teachers, we will mention this to you. Number two, the masail, the discussions within the chapter need to be retained at a very high level. You have to be able to mention those discussions. And number three, the correct opinion within those discussions. Oftentimes, Al-Qudūrī himself will mention the correct opinion, but as we mentioned in our classes regarding the Mukhtaṣar, that sometimes, from time to time, Al-Qudūrī will not always mention the mu'tamad, the relied upon opinion. We will clarify that for you, and obviously once that is clarified for you, you have to make sure you retain that as well as what Al-Qudūrī has mentioned. And sometimes you'll find that Al-Qudūrī, for instance, has not mentioned all the details in the discussion, if those details are mentioned to you regarding certain rulings, that also has to be retained, and it's very important. So at this level, what you're looking for in the Mukhtaṣar is not necessarily memorizing the matan, the text itself. It's understanding the text to such a level that if you were asked to repeat the discussions in Tahara, for instance, if you were asked regarding the qaida or the general rule or the general philosophy that dictates the discussions in the chapter of, let's assume, nawaqid al-wudu, what things break the wudu, you should be able to mention that, and based on that general principle, you should be able to say that accordingly. For instance, khuruj al-najasa, if impurity was to exit from a person from anywhere, it would result in wudu breaking. But if that impurity exits from a sabilain, it has so and so ruling. If that impurity exits from another area in the body, it has a different ruling. If, for instance, someone laughs out loud in salah, over here impurity is not exiting. So now the faqih, the student, he has to be able to explain why, even though this is going against the rule, why we said that laughing out loud in salah, for instance, will result in wudu breaking. So these are the main things the student needs to remember when it comes to the Mukhtaṣar. Not necessarily memorizing the matan. You can also do that if you want, but understanding the masail, understanding the logic behind the discussions, and being able to reiterate that logic when asked. Alright, now we come to the crux of the discussion, which is the mutafarri'at, those books that stem from the Mukhtaṣar. And this is extremely important. The books that stem from the Mukhtaṣar are many. We've mentioned the most famous books over here, beginning with Bidāyat al-Mubtadī of al-Marghīnānī. Al-Imām al-Marghīnānī, the famous author of al-Hidayah, prior to authoring al-Hidayah, which is the famous commentary taught worldwide for centuries, just as the Mukhtaṣar has been taught worldwide for centuries, Al-Imām al-Marghīnānī authored a book titled Bidāyat al-Mubtadī. Bidāyat al-Mubtadī, in which he simply mentioned rulings themselves, meaning he did not mention the proof behind the ruling, he only mentioned the ruling within their respective chapters. And to do so, he gathered between two books. He took al-Jāmi' al-Saghīr of al-Imām Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, and he took the Mukhtaṣar of al-Imām al-Qudūrī, and he said that I found that these books were the most prevalent in our institutions. The students were all studying these books, they were worried about these books. So I took these books, I gathered their masail, the discussions mentioned within them, in Bidāyat al-Mubtadī. Then al-Marghīnānī commented on Bidāyat al-Mubtadī in a book he titled Kifāyat al-Muntahī. Kifāyat al-Muntahī, which was an extensive commentary. But he feared that students would not give it the time and they would not access the commentary properly because it's very extensive. And for that reason, he summarized Kifāyat al-Muntahī into the Hidayah. The famous book Al-Hidayah is actually a smaller commentary written after Kifāyat al-Muntahī was written. And that's why Al-Hidayah is so special. Because Al-Hidayah, the fact that he's writing Al-Hidayah after having authored Kifāyat al-Muntahī, which is an extensive commentary, right? It allows Al-Imām al-Marghīnānī to hide, volumes of meaning, hide loads of information behind every single word and every single line within the Hidayah. And that's why if you were to take the Hidayah apart systematically, every small line, every small structure, you realize that there are books or there are pages of information, not books per se, but there are pages of information hidden behind those small lines because he's taking a larger commentary and he's summarizing it into a very small work. And since that's the case, this small work, every single word in it is very important. And I myself and many of our mashayikh and our friends, they also experience this. When you study the Hidayah, at first you think it's just a normal book. But sometimes you look at a mutawwal, you look at a larger book in the madhhab, for instance, al-Saraks al-Mabsūt, or you look at al-Kasani's Bidāyat al-Sanā'i', or you look at, for instance, al-Muḥīṭ al-Burhānī, larger books in the madhhab. And then you come back to al-Hidayah, you'll find that oftentimes the discussion mentioned in those larger books within 2-3 pages are summarized by al-Marghīnānī in half a page in his Hidayah. And in order to do that, you realize that each and every single word needs to be unpacked, and it has a lot of meanings and a lot of information hidden behind it. That's why the Hidayah was so special. And being so special, the Hidayah itself had multiple commentaries written on it. One of these commentaries was Nihayatul Kifaya, which was authored by Taj al-Shari'a al-Mahbūbī. Now, Taj al-Shari'a al-Mahbūbī, you might find that he passed away in the year 673, but we have books, manuscripts of the Nihayatul Kifaya, which seem to indicate that his death was much later on. So it would make sense for him to pass away sometime after the year 696. نهاية الكفاية of Taj al-Sharia al-Mahbūbī. And then you have al-Nihāya, this is a different book, al-Nihāya of al-Istighnaaqī. Now this is a very extensive commentary. It was so extensive that al-Babirti, he writes in the beginning of his Inaya, that because the commentary was so extensive, I felt that it would be difficult, and truly it was difficult for teachers to retain all that information when teaching the book. And for this reason, he says, I essentially summarized the content of al-Nihāya, as well as the other commentaries I could access, into al-Inaya. And this is why al-Inaya is a very short commentary, but you can say short and sweet. It covers all the important discussions. Generally speaking, he explains what al-Imām al-Marghīnānī is saying, and at the same time he's filled the book with discussions pertaining to usul, because al-Babirti himself has multiple books which he authored in al-usul. Now after al-Babirti, later on, another scholar came and he was teaching, or he would teach the Hidayah, he would teach the Inaya, and so some of his students gathered his notes and wrote them out as a footnote on the Inaya. This is a Hashiyah which was gathered later on. After al-Nihāya of al-Istighnaaqī, we have al-Atqāni. Al-Atqāni Ghāyatul Bayān. And the book is very special. The book is very special, and along with being special, al-Atqāni he's very impressed with himself. May Allah have mercy on him and bless him. Now obviously certain discussions in the Ghāya, in Ghāyatul Bayān I'm referring to over here, of al-Atqāni, who passed away in the year 758, are very special. He analyzes stuff critically. He is not one to simply agree just because others have said so. And he will give you the most important discussion where there is a need. Although he may not write in the same length as other commentators such as al-Aini, he'll gather the most important things and he'll mention them to you in Ghayatul Bayan of al-Atqāni. Al-Atqāni, also known as al-Atrazi, later on when al-Aini came along, al-Aini, the author of al-Bināya, as well as many other books. Al-Aini is also the author of many other books in fiqh, as we're going to see in the chart right now, and other books in hadith as well, commentaries on hadith such as Umdatul Qari and Nukhab al-Afkar. Amazing books he's authored. He made a point to actually correct some of the mistakes or object against al-Atqāni in many areas, in many instances in his al-Bināya. And when he takes something of benefit from al-Atqāni, he won't actually reference him, but when he corrects a mistake mentioned by al-Atqāni, at that point he will mention that al-Atrazi said so and so, and it's incorrect. Now obviously that does not mean that al-Aini, his commentary is not good. In fact, his commentary, in terms of how much it encompasses, and in terms of inclusiveness, it is perhaps the most fitting commentary on the Hidayah. Now what does that mean? Every commentary has a certain flavor. Every commentary has a certain benefit. Just like every author, he writes in a certain manner. So Al-Aini's Al-Bināya is good in the sense that he will explain each and every single word to you. And in that sense, it's the truest work to a commentary written on the Hidayah, because he's going to explain every single thing to you. Ibn al-Humam, for instance, Al-Atqāni, right? They'll say, this is simple, I don't need to explain this. But Al-Aini will say, no, I will explain each and every single word for you, and he will explain it thoroughly. And along with that, he'll also, when it comes to discussions on hadith, he'll go in full detail. He'll mention all the ahadith, or a good degree of ahadith he has come across, and he'll explain those ahadith as well. And likewise, he'll quote from different scholars, he'll quote the madhhab from different fuqaha, the views of different fuqaha, different riwayat in the madhhab, and then he'll give preference as well. So in this sense, Al-Aini's commentary is complete, because he gathers everything. But the commentary is very long, perhaps on account of the fact that he has done lengthy takhrij. Takhrij over here means sourcing ahadith to their primary sources within his commentaries, and all of his commentaries, in fact, the larger ones at least. But again, as I've mentioned, the commentary, in terms of being inclusive, in terms of commentating on everything mentioned by al-Marghīnānī, perhaps no one surpasses Al-Aini in this. And then after this, we have the masterpiece, Fathul Qadir of Ibn al-Humam. Fathul Qadir of Ibn al-Humam is a book that holds a very special rank within the madhhab, just as its author holds a very special rank within the madhhab. And this is why when Ibn al-Humam says something, oftentimes you see after Ibn al-Humam, scholars will begin to lean towards what Ibn al-Humam said. Ash-Shurun-Bulali, for instance, being one of them, the author of Nur al-Idah, which we've studied previously, and other books in the madhhab, Ash-Shurun-Bulali, he will often lean towards what Ibn al-Humam gives preference to. So Ibn al-Humam is very special. He's a master in usul, a master in fiqh, and he had a good understanding of ahadith, and he relied heavily in ahadith on al-Zayla'i, which we'll cover soon bi'idhnillah. But in his Fath al-Qadir, he's written a lengthy and amazing commentary discussing the areas that need discussion, not every single word like al-Aini, but the areas that require discussion in detail. And from after Ibn al-Humam, perhaps everyone in the madhhab is taken from him. Post Ibn al-Humam, everyone, including Ibn Nujaym in his al-Baḥr al-Ra'iq, including Ibn Abidin in his famous Hashiyah, they've all benefited from Ibn al-Humam. And so the book is very special, but unfortunately this edition we have of the book, it has mistakes in it, quite a few mistakes. Oftentimes you'll find the text is out of place, or perhaps you'll find that there is a typo within the text that changes the entire meaning, right? So it takes time to unpack, but the book is very special. And as I've mentioned, Ibn Humam was a master in usul as well as the ma'qulat, right? Different sciences which are extremely, extremely important to understanding fiqh. He has his famous At-Tahrir, which he authored within usul, which was a revolutionary book, and it itself has multiple commentaries, such as Ibn Amir al-Hajj, and other commentaries such as Taysir al-Tahrir. But the point over here is that Ibn Humam's Fath al-Qadir is very important, and the mabahith, the discussions he brought in the Fath, were also extremely important. Now, a lot of these authors, they benefited heavily from, or perhaps not a lot of these authors, but commentators on the Hidayah in general, they benefited heavily from a book titled Nasb al-Raya. Nasb al-Raya, which was authored by Jamaluddin al-Zayla'i, who passed away in the year 762. Jamaluddin al-Zayla'i. Nasb al-Raya was a book in which al-Zayla'i gathered all the ahadith mentioned by al-Marghīnānī in Hidayah, and then he sourced them back to their primary sources extensively. Extensively meaning that it's in books of Takhrij, you study that when you study sourcing ahadith back to their sources, there are certain books that are very short. Then we have books that are, we say mutawassit, right? It's not too short, not too long. And then we have lengthy books. Nasb al-Raya is more on the lengthy side. So he's gathered a lot of ahadith, and he quotes a lot from Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, for instance, al-Imām. He quotes a lot from him and other books in his Nasb al-Raya. And he's gathered these ahadith which are mentioned in Hidayah. If he finds the wording, he will mention the wording, and he'll mention the other wordings that support it. If need be, he'll mention similar narrations. Sometimes he will do tad'if. He will mention that these narrations are weak. Other times he'll say that they're strong. Or if they're weak, he'll mention other strong narrations in the chapter. So the book is extremely beneficial. And anyone who wants to look at the ahadith mentioned in Al-Hidayah, they should certainly go back to Nasb al-Raya. Like I mentioned, now Nasb al-Raya was very long. And because Nasb al-Raya was very long, Ibn Hajar, the great Shafi'i muhaddith, he came along and he summarized Nasb al-Raya into ad-Diraya. He summarized Nasb al-Raya into ad-Diraya. And Ibn Hajar's student, Ibn Hajar and Ibn Humam's student, in fact, Al-Qasim ibn Qutb, who is also a strong Hanafi scholar, as we'll come to see soon bi'idhnillah, he actually authored a book titled Munyatul al-Ma'i. Munyatul al-Ma'i. What is Munyatul al-Ma'i? Ibn Qutb says that I read the works of al-Zayla'i, I read my teacher Ibn Hajar's works, as well as al-Aini, because like I mentioned to you, al-Aini is very effective, or he's very strong when it comes to sourcing ahadith back to their sources. He says that I read these books, but there are certain ahadith which are mentioned by al-Marghīnānī, which these authors have not made mention of. So in order to gather those ahadith and source back those ahadith which I can from amongst them, I have authored Munyatul al-Ma'i. So this is essentially a completion of Nasb al-Raya and other books in this field. And with that, we've covered the books or the commentaries and the books of Takhrij that stem from the Hidayah. Now, a very interesting book that stemmed from the Hidayah, again, al-Hidayah is authored by al-Marghīnānī, was al-Wiqāyah. Al-Wiqāyah is not a commentary. Al-Wiqāyah is not a commentary. This is another matan. It's another Mukhtaṣar. And essentially what the author, Burhan al-Shari'a al-Mahbūbī, as his grandson referred to him, who passed away in the year 673, what he essentially did was, he took the Hidayah. Again, Hidayah is a sharh, so it has multiple masail, has long discussions, and as tasheeh. Oftentimes, al-Marghīnānī will give preference to a certain opinion. And al-Marghīnānī is a very high faqih in the school. He has a very high rank in the school. So al-Mahbūbī comes along, Burhan al-Shari'a. He takes al-Marghīnānī's Hidayah, and what he does after taking al-Marghīnānī's Hidayah is, he summarizes the main discussions, the most important masail, right, referring to the strongest opinions, into another Mukhtaṣar. And this he names wiqayatu al-riwaya, wiqayatu al-riwaya bi masail al-hidayah, or wiqayatu al-riwaya fi masail al-hidayah. Why did he do this? He did this for his grandson, Sadr al-Sharia al-Thani, Ubaydullah. When he seen that his grandson had covered his other studies, and it was time for him to study fiqh, he felt that it would be appropriate for him to author a Mukhtaṣar which was fit for his grandson. And so he wrote a Mukhtaṣar called al-Wiqaya, right, in short, for his grandson. His very same grandson, Sadr al-Sharia al-Thani, he came along and he wrote a commentary on this Wiqaya, which was authored by his grandfather, and that commentary came to be known as Sharh al-Wiqaya, which is a very famous commentary in the school. He wrote this commentary, Sharh al-Wiqaya. Sharh al-Wiqaya, in turn, was met with many glosses. What is a gloss? A gloss is a footnote, a hashiyah. So you have many larger, or you can say a super gloss, written on Sharh al-Wiqaya, which was authored by Sadr al-Sharia al-Thani. Sadr al-Sharia al-Thani, al-Mahbūbī, passed away in the year 747. This was met with many hawashi, one of them being Mullah Khusraw's hashiyah, another, for instance, being the Laknawi's. Laknawi, the father, Sheikh Abdul Halim al-Laknawi, who passed away in the year 1253, as well as the son, who authored multiple books on as hawashi on the Sharh al-Wiqaya. The first of these was as-Si'aya, or not the first of these per se, but the longer of these was as-Si'aya. As-Si'aya fi kashfi ma fi Sharh al-Wiqaya. When Laknawi was studying the book with his father, he also wrote a hashiyah at that time. Then afterwards, he felt that the hashiyah was quite small, so he expanded upon it in as-Si'aya, which is one of the greatest books written in the madhhab in recent times, which is extremely extensive, and it covers the madhhab from every aspect. And there are many views, or not many views per se, but there are a few areas where al-Laknawi is actually given preference to something beyond the madhhab as well. But he felt that the book was too long, and he felt that he might not have been able to finish it, and so he began to author a smaller sharh, Umdatul Ri'aya, on the Sharh al-Wiqaya. And unfortunately, neither of these books were completed by al-Imam al-Laknawi, although he got much further in his Umdatul Ri'aya. But unfortunately, neither of these books were completed by al-Imam al-Laknawi, who lived a short life but left a lasting legacy. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him. So now we have a few commentaries or a few glosses on the Sharh al-Wiqaya. The very author of Sharh al-Wiqaya, who is Sadr al-Sharia al-Thani, the grandson, he also summarized his father's matan, al-Wiqaya, into a smaller matan. So he took the matan of his father, al-Wiqaya, wiqayatu riwaya, fi masail al-hidayah, and then he summarized it into a smaller matan titled al-Nuqaya, right, a smaller Mukhtaṣar. He said that, I feel that I see today that students, they have lost their motivation to study. Subhanallah, he's saying this in his time. And for this reason, I've authored this smaller Mukhtaṣar. Those who are not able to understand the Wiqaya, they don't want to study the Wiqaya, they can study the smaller Mukhtaṣar. And those who want to understand the Masail, mention al-Hidayah, and they want to retain those Masail, they can study the larger Mukhtaṣar, which is the Wiqaya. But I've authored this Mukhtaṣar al-Nuqaya for students who do not want to, or who want to study a smaller work. And obviously al-Nuqaya itself was met with multiple commentaries, perhaps the most famous of them being al-Quhustani's commentary titled Jami' al-Rumuz by al-Quhustani, as well as Mullah Ali Qari's Fath Bab al-Inayah, which is a very special book. In fact, al-Kashmiri says it's his best book. It is the best book he's written, Fath Bab al-Inayah, in terms of its accuracy and in terms of its precision. And Mullah Ali Qari in general was a master, or was a scholar in hadith and fiqh, as well as other sciences. Jami' al-Rumuz of al-Quhustani, once again the scholars over here, they say that this book is not actually fit. This book is not actually fit for fatawa. This is what they mention. However, with this being the case, we find that a lot of other scholars have quoted this. Quite a few scholars quote this. And the reasoning they give is that we actually don't know who al-Quhustani was. And because of the fact that we don't know who al-Quhustani was, it would not be fit to give fatwa from this book. But other scholars, recent contemporaries such as Sheikh Lu'ay al-Khalili, he's mentioned that this needs to be revisited. Just as Sheikh Said Baktash mentioned that the discussion regarding al-Mujtaba al-Zahidi needs to be revisited as well. Now, so al-Wiqaya was summarized in al-Nuqaya. On the other hand, al-Wiqaya itself was summarized by a later scholar, right, not from the Mahbūbī family, Ibn Kamal Basha, he summarized the wiqaya into al-Islah. And then he wrote a commentary on al-Islah titled al-Idah. And in the beginning of his commentary, al-Idah, he actually mentions that despite the rank al-Wiqaya holds, he says that it has certain mistakes within it. And when it comes to al-Wiqaya, he's more respectful. Not respectful per se, but he does not point out too much. He just says that al-Wiqaya has certain mistakes. So I authored a matan al-Islah because I wanted to correct these mistakes. And then I authored al-Idah to clarify the many mistakes found in Sharh al-Wiqaya. So he feels that there are mistakes in al-Wiqaya and in Sharh al-Wiqaya. And so he authored a matan and a sharh to clarify and to correct those mistakes. Now obviously later on, commentators on the Wiqaya, they were not too fond of this. And that's why we actually find commentators like Ibrahim ibn Ubaidillah, who passed away in the year 973. In his commentary, in his gloss on the Sharh al-Wiqaya, he makes a point to correct the mistakes which Ibn Kamal Basha was making. So Ibn Kamal Basha is assuming that al-Mahbūbī, the two Mahbūbīs, the author of al-Wiqaya and his grandson, the author of Sharh al-Wiqaya, are making mistakes. And so he's saying, I will correct them. Ibrahim ibn Ubaidillah comes along and says, no, wait a minute, you're the one who's making mistakes. So he begins to correct him. And this is something we find amongst the scholars within the madhhab, that they will not agree with something simply because someone else has said it. They will be critical, they will analyze the statements, and then in a fair approach, they will mention what they deem to be stronger. In a respectful approach, they will mention what they deem to be stronger, and at the same time, they will correct errors made by earlier scholars. And this is prevalent throughout all madhahib, including the Hanafi madhhab. Now with this, we've covered all the books that actually stem from Bidāyat al-Mubtadī. Up until now, these are all the books that have stemmed from Bidāyat al-Mubtadī, because we covered Kifāyat al-Muntahi, we covered al-Hidayah, and then all the books that stem from Hidayah, including commentaries, as well as books of Takhrij, and then the Mukhtaṣar al-Wiqāya that stems from the Hidayah, as well as the two Mukhtaṣarat that stem from al-Wiqāya, al-Islah, and al-Nuqāya, their commentaries, and likewise the different commentaries that stem from al-Wiqāya, Sharh al-Wiqāya, and the glosses written on the Sharh al-Wiqāya. Now let's move to another discussion, and this is the discussion regarding the second mutafarrid, the second book that stems from the Mukhtaṣar, which is Majmaʿ al-Baḥrayn of Ibn Sa'ati. Ibn Sa'ati passed away in the year 694, and he was a master in usul, a strong scholar in usul, as well as a very strong scholar in fiqh. And so he gathered a book called Majmaʿ al-Baḥrayn, the meeting of the two oceans. What are the two oceans? The first ocean is Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī, and the second ocean is Nadm al-Khilāfiyyāt. What is Nadm al-Khilāfiyyāt? Nadm al-Khilāfiyyāt was authored by Abu Hafs al-Nasafī. Abu Hafs al-Nasafī, this is an earlier Nasafi. The famous Nasafi in the school, whose books we're going to cover soon, is Hafizuddin Abu al-Barakat al-Nasafī. Abu Hafs al-Nasafī is an earlier scholar who authored a book called Nadm al-Khilāfiyyāt. It's a poem, and he has about 10 chapters in the poem. And what he does in the poem is he mentions those masail, those discussions which are mukhtalaf fiha. So first he mentions all the views of Abu Hanifa, then the views of, in the second chapter, Abu Yusuf, then in the third chapter, the views of Muhammad, then in the fourth chapter, the views of Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, for instance, then the views of Abu Hanifa and Muhammad, then the views of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, in this manner, then the views of Zufar, then the views of al-Shafi'i, then the views of al-Imam Malik. So in this manner, he's gathered the masail which are mukhtalaf fiha according to all the imam in this beautiful poem. And this poem, obviously, on account of being so special, we have many commentaries on this in the madhhab itself. One of the ones who commented on this poem was none other than the later al-Nasafi, Hafizuddin Abu al-Barakat. He wrote a commentary on this poem, as well as other mashayikh. Ibn Sa'ati took the contents of this poem, and he took the contents of Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī, and he gathered them in a matan, which he titled Majmaʿ al-Baḥrayn. And this was later on commented on by al-Aini. Like I mentioned, al-Aini has multiple books in the madhhab, as well as Ibn Malik. Ibn Malik with a fatha on the lam, right? Ibn Firishta, who has multiple works in usul, as well as fiqh. Then we come across the great Hafizuddin Abu al-Barakat al-Nasafi. Al-Nasafi took the Mukhtaṣar of al-Imam al-Qudūrī, and he added onto it the masail found within Nadm al-Khilāfiyyāt, right, or Manzumat al-Khilāfiyyāt of Abu Hafs al-Nasafi. Just like he added onto it the masail found within the two Jami'ain, which he refers to al-Jami'ain al-Saghir wal-Kabir. What are the Jami'ain? Imam Muhammad had multiple books which he referred to, which were referred to as the Zahir al-Riwayah. We explained this in previous lessons. Amongst these books was al-Jami' al-Kabir, al-Jami' al-Saghir, and al-Ziyadat. Al-Nasafī took the contents or the Masail, the discussions found within these three books, as well as the Masail, the discussions found within Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī, as well as the discussions found within Manzūmat al-Khilāfiyyāt. And he gathered all of them in a book he titled al-Wāfī. And not just this, he also added in certain Masail from the genre of al-Fatawa wal-Waqi'at. Al-Fatawa wal-Waqi'at. In fact, Burhan al-Shari'a al-Mahbūbī also did this in the Wiqāyah. But al-Nasafī, he himself also mentions this, that I've gathered certain discussions, I've mentioned certain discussions which are prevalent from the al-Fatawa and al-Waqi'at, which is a third genre altogether. We have Zahir al-Riwayah, Nadir al-Riwayah, and the Nawazil, as we've explained previously. So al-Nasafī in his matan in the Wāfī, he's actually gathered these Masail as well. Then he commentated on al-Wāfī in his al-Kāfī. So this was the commentary written by al-Nasafī himself. He commentates on the discussions in al-Wāfī in his commentary referred to as al-Kāfī. And interestingly, al-Nasafī, he actually makes a point that, he mentions this in the Muqaddimah of al-Kāfī, that he will clarify some of the discussions that were left vague within the Hidayah. Now, what's the reasoning behind this? In Ghayatul Bayan, al-Atqāni, he actually mentions that al-Nasafī had wanted to write a commentary on the Hidayah. But one of the great scholars of that century, Taj al-Shari'a, he said that he's not ready for it. So instead what he did was he wrote his own matan, similar to the Hidayah, or the Bidāyat al-Mubtadī, and then he wrote a commentary, just like al-Marghīnānī wrote a commentary on his Bidāyat al-Mubtadī. But he made a point, مُوضِحًا لِمَا أُبْهِمَ مِنْ فِي الْهِدَايَةِ مِنَ النُّكَاتِ. نعم. Something along those lines. He says that I will clarify the discussions which are mentioned in the Hidayah, which are not too clear. And I will correct, essentially, if there's any error, I will correct it. That's why you'll find that a lot of the commentators on the Hidayah, Ibn al-Imām included, they do refer back a lot to al-Nasafī, specifically from his al-Kāfī. Yeah. Al-Nasafī himself, after authoring the Kāfī and the Wāfī, he decided that al-Wāfī is a bit long. So I will summarize this into Kanz al-Daqā'iq. And this is the famous Mukhtaṣar of al-Nasafī, Kanz al-Daqā'iq, which is taught throughout Madaris, throughout the world. He essentially summarized this from al-Wāfī. Again, al-Wāfī took from multiple books, the two Jami' al-Saghir al-Kabir, al-Ziyadat, Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī, Manzūmat al-Khilāfiyyāt. And then al-Nasafī takes this and he summarized the context, as well as the books of Fatawa al-Waqi'at, certain Fatawa al-Waqi'at which are prevalent. Al-Nasafī takes this and summarizes them into Kanz al-Daqā'iq, including certain discussions from the Fatawa and the Waqi'at, certain rulings. Kanz al-Daqā'iq, on account of being such a brief yet accurate and precise Mukhtaṣar, is thereafter met by multiple commentaries. One of them being Fakhruddin al-Zayla'i. This is not the same Zayla'i as before. The earlier Zayla'i was Jamaluddin. He authored the book in Hadith, Takhrij. This is a book in fiqh, and the author is a very strong faqih, and the book is a very good read as well in terms of fiqh. Tabyin al-Haqa'iq of Fakhruddin al-Zayla'i. After him, Al-Aini, he authored Ramz al-Haqa'iq. Ramz al-Haqa'iq, once again, the Mashayikh, the scholars of Usul al-Ifta, they say that this is not fit to issue fatwa from. Why is this the case? They say this, you shouldn't be issuing fatwa from this because the book is very concise. And oftentimes when the book is very concise, it's possible the person can misunderstand what's being said. So for this reason, they say that one should not issue fatwa from this. But Shaykh Hussain Kadodi mentions that in terms of teaching and understanding the book, perhaps it's the best commentary. In terms of teaching and understanding what al-Nasafī is and trying to mention, perhaps Ramz al-Haqa'iq is indeed the best commentary. After Ramz al-Haqa'iq, we have al-Baḥr, which is the encyclopedia of the school, authored by Ibn Nujaym, who passed away in the year 970. This is the older brother. He authored al-Baḥr, which is essentially an encyclopedia within the school. And if you want to see how beautiful this book is, just open the Muqaddimah and read all the books. Read through the names of all the books which Ibn Nujaym says I refer back to in writing this book, al-Baḥr. And it truly is a bahr. After Ibn Nujaym, the older brother, who passed away in the year 970, his younger brother comes along, Sirajuddin, who passed away in the year 1005, and he said that there was a few mistakes made by my brother in his commentary on the Kanz. So I will correct those mistakes, and therefore he wrote An-Nahr al-Fa'iq. And he aimed to correct some of what he deemed to be mistakes of his older brother, Ibn Nujaym, in his Bahr. Later on, the great scholar Ibn Abidin comes along, and Ibn Abidin writes Minhatul Khaliq. This is the footnote on the Bahr. Ibn Abidin has a famous footnote, Hashit Ibn Abidin, the Rad which is written on the Durr al-Mukhtar of al-Haskafi. And then he has another book, right, referred to as Minhatul Khaliq, which is a hashiyah on al-Baḥr. So just to help you understand this, al-Baḥr is a commentary on Nasafi's Kanz al-Daqā'iq. Ibn Abidin wrote a hashiyah on al-Baḥr, in which he mentions that he will take from certain points made by the younger Ibn Nujaym and Nahr al-Fa'iq. He'll mention these points as well as Khairuddin al-Ramli. He'll mention these points, and he wrote an extensive hashiyah on the Baḥr, which just added to his value. And then on the other hand, Ibn Abidin has another hashiyah, which is the famous Radd al-Muhtar of Ibn Abidin, which is a hashiyah which he authored on al-Haskafi's commentary, al-Durr al-Mukhtar, on al-Tumurtashi's Tanwir al-Absar, which is another matan in the school. A beautiful matan later on that was authored, al-Tumurtashi's Tanwir al-Absar. It had multiple commentaries, one of them being al-Haskafi's al-Durr al-Mukhtar. And then Ibn Abidin wrote a commentary, or a hashiyah to be exact, a super gloss, on the Durr, which is titled Radd al-Muhtar. And that, generally speaking, when Ibn Abidin is quoted, everyone refers to that book. But along with that, he also has other books, one of them being Minhatul Khaliq, which is a hashiyah on Ibn Nujaym's al-Baḥr. And with this, we've covered the Nasafi strand as well. What we have left now is Multaqā al-Abḥur, the meeting of the different oceans. Subhanallah. Al-Ḥalabī, Ibrahim al-Ḥalabī said that he decided to gather many of these mukhtasarat, many of these books, these mutun, they were authored before him, into one book. And so he gathered the discussions mentioned in the Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī. He gathered the discussions mentioned in al-Wiqāyah of Burhan al-Sharia. He gathered the discussions mentioned in al-Mukhtar. Al-Mukhtar is another matan within the school, authored by al-Mawsili, which is also one of the mu'tamad, one of the relied upon mutun within the madhhab. And he also gathered the discussions mentioned in Kanz al-Daqā'iq, within the Multaqā, within Multaqā al-Abḥur, as well as certain fatawa and al-Wāqi'at. And he made a point, Ibrahim al-Ḥalabī actually made a point, he mentions this. He says that I will gather the Masail of Quduri, al-Mukhtar, al-Kanz, al-Wiqāyah with very simple and easy to understand text, in a very simple and easy to understand text, as well as certain discussions from al-Majmaʿ. Al-Majmaʿ referring to Majmaʿ al-Baḥrayn of Ibn Sa'ati, and a few points from al-Hidayah referring to Marghīnānī's famous Hidayah. And he'll mention the differences between the A'immah, the scholars, and then he mentions وَقَدَّمْتُ مِنْ أَقَاوِيلِهِمْ مَا هُوَ الْأَرْجَحِ. They relied upon view, I'll mention that first. And then after that, I'll mention the not so strong view. So he'll mention the relied upon view first, and then he'll mention the other views within the school, unless he mentions the second view and then he adds on something which indicates that it is stronger. إِلَّا أَنْ قَيَّدْتُهُ بِمَا يُفِيدُ التَّرْجِيحِ. Unless he mentions the second view and then he adds on a wording which indicates that this second view is stronger. So al-Ḥalabī, Ibrahim al-Ḥalabī, in his Mukhtaṣar, the Multaqā al-Abḥur, his methodology is to mention the stronger view first and then mention other views, unless when mentioning the second or third view he mentions a wording which indicates that it is actually stronger. But generally speaking, the default within the Multaqā is to mention the stronger view in the school first. And this is as opposed to, for instance, Al-Qudūrī in his Mukhtaṣar. Al-Qudūrī in the Mukhtaṣar will sometimes mention multiple views, but he doesn't have a habit of always mentioning the stronger view first or the stronger view last. So this is important to keep in mind for the Multaqā. Al-Multaqā had multiple commentaries, one of them being Majmaʿ al-Anhur of Shaykh Abdul Rahman Shaykhi Zada, as well as al-Haskafi. Remember, al-Haskafi had another book titled al-Durr al-Mukhtar on Tumurtashi's Tanwir al-Absar, which was later met by a hashiyah by Ibn Abidin and Tahtawi, just Ibn Abidin, Tahtawi, Shaykh al-Sindi, Tawali al-Anwar, multiple commentaries on al-Durr al-Mukhtar of al-Haskafi. On the other hand, al-Haskafi has another al-Durr. He has another book he titled al-Durr al-Muntaqā. Al-Durr al-Muntaqā is al-Haskafi's commentary on Multaqā al-Abḥur. So Multaqā al-Abḥur is a matan. On it, al-Haskafi wrote al-Durr al-Muntaqā, just like al-Haskafi wrote al-Durr al-Mukhtar on Tumurtashi's Tanwir al-Absar. Now we have it included that in the chart over here, because it's a famous book in the madhhab, I will mention it regardless. Al-Haskafi wrote al-Durr al-Mukhtar on Tumurtashi's Tanwir al-Absar, which is a different matan. And then al-Durr al-Mukhtar was met by multiple commentaries and hawashi, the most famous of them being al-Tahtawi's hashiyah, Ibn Abidin's hashiyah, and al-Sindi's Tawali al-Anwar. And with this we've covered majority or many of the books that stem from the Mukhtaṣar. Finally, what's left is a very interesting book, which perhaps you can refer to as a commentary, but not so much a commentary, as other commentaries. Ibn Qutb, who I mentioned to you, is the student of Ibn al-Humam and the student of Ibn Hajar. He authored a very interesting book on the Mukhtaṣar, and this book he titled al-Tasḥīḥ wa-al-Tarjīḥ. What is the Tasḥīḥ and the Tarjīḥ? He says that there are a few views mentioned in the Mukhtaṣar which are perhaps not the strongest. And then in other discussions, Al-Imām al-Qudūrī will mention multiple views in the Mukhtaṣar. So for this reason, he authored al-Tasḥīḥ wa-al-Tarjīḥ, right? In order to correct and in order to give preference between multiple views mentioned within the Mukhtaṣar in his book, al-Tasḥīḥ wa-al-Tarjīḥ, to help the student understand the relied upon view in the school. And in this, he often quotes Qadi Khan, an earlier scholar in the madhhab, contemporary of al-Marghīnānī. Oftentimes he quotes al-Marghīnānī himself, and he quotes multiple scholars within the madhhab in determining the mu'tamad. Now obviously as a student does not need to worry, should not have to worry about looking for the mu'tamad. This is the job of the teacher, who will present the mu'tamad to him, as well as the legal reasoning behind the views held by al-Qudūrī in the Mukhtaṣar. But as I mentioned, a student should obviously refer back to Hawashi and different books on the Mukhtaṣar to ensure that he is reading and he is studying the Mukhtaṣar as it ought to be studied. And as you see over here, subhanAllah, the Mukhtaṣar is a very special book. It's not just a simple book. It's not just one book. It's one book, but if you understand the discussions within this one book, all of these different books that will become easy for you. So al-Wāfī stems from it. Majmaʿ al-Baḥrayn stems from it. Bidāyat al-Mubtadī, the famous Hidayah, stems from it. Multaqā al-Abḥur stems from it. And multiple different mutun within the madhhab study stem from the Mukhtaṣar. So if you understand the discussion within the Mukhtaṣar thoroughly, it will be very easy for you to read different mutun and different texts. And then at a later level, you can obviously compare how did al-Qudūrī mention this ruling as opposed to al-Nasafī, for instance. Why did al-Nasafī change the wording? Why did al-Nasafī why did Burhan al-Shari'a in his Wiqāyah give preference to a different ruling, a different riwayah, a different narration within the madhhab? So if you understand the Mukhtaṣar thoroughly, this will be your gateway and your key to all the other books within the madhhab bi'idhnillah. And with this we have covered the legacy of Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī, this chart which we have made. But obviously the legacy of Mukhtaṣar al-Qudūrī is not something which is confined to ourselves as students of the madhhab. It's going to go beyond, above and beyond. And bi'idhnillah, just as this book has been being taught for centuries post al-Imām al-Qudūrī up until our time, bi'idhnillah will continue to be taught. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us as students to be from those who engage with this blessed book, with this blessed work, teach it and study it, as well as yourselves as students. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows you to understand and to study this blessed book. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.